The enemy has captured 3 settlements in the Zaporizhzhia region. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrskyi. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine noted that the enemy is using weather conditions, thick fog, to infiltrate between positions. Ukraine's defense forces continue to operate according to the principle of active defense. The enemy is currently focusing its main efforts in the Pokrovsk direction, but in the Zaporizhzhia region, the enemy has also become more active. The situation has significantly worsened in the Alexandrovsk and Huliapol directions.
Taking advantage of its numerical superiority in manpower and equipment, the enemy advanced during fierce fighting and captured 3 settlements. The soldiers of the South Military Group are engaged in grueling battles for Ravnopoli and Yablokovo.
Also, on the Telegram channel Sniper Plus says, run by the mayor of Henichesk, Stanislav Bunyatov, with the call sign Osman, it is noted that in 2026, the Zaporizhzhia direction could face a collapse from the right flank. Russia may take Pokrovsk. Putin is throwing everything into capturing the city, but he will pay a high price for it. This is the opinion of analysts from the Institute for the Study of War. American analysts note that the Russian military command has decided to conduct several offensive operations simultaneously across the entire theater of military operations, particularly in the Kharkiv region near Vovchansk and Kupiansk, in the northeast of the Donetsk region's fortified belt, and near the border junction of Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhzhia regions. The Institute for the Study of War notes that the Russian military command has demonstrated its willingness to accept significant losses and the time required for such campaigns. But even such an exhausting tactic does not play into Russia's hands. Foreign Affairs writes that Vladimir Putin is a year behind schedule in capturing Pokrovsk, as he had planned to enter the city by November 2024. Despite their significant numerical advantage, the Russians were unable to quickly break through the Ukrainian armed forces' defenses. Every month, more than 20,000 occupiers are eliminated. According to the Ukrainian armed forces, there are currently more than 300 Russians in Pokrovsk.
On November 12th, the Ukrainian armed forces attacked the Stavrolen defense plant in Budyonovsk, Stavropol Krai, Russian Federation, as well as an ammunition depot in the temporarily occupied Novi Svet, according to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces.
As part of efforts to reduce the production capabilities of petrochemical products for the needs of the Russian aggressor's military-industrial complex, Ukrainian defense forces struck the infrastructure of Stavrolen.
The plant has a full cycle of hydrocarbon raw material processing and produces polymers used in the manufacture of composite materials, body parts, seals, and insulation for various types of equipment used by the Russian Federation's army. Among other things, it also produces components for drones. Stavrolen is a subsidiary of Lukoil. The plant supplies products to local manufacturers and provides raw materials for the petrochemical industry of the Russian Federation. Numerous explosions and a fire were recorded at the site of the impact. It is also known that, in order to reduce the enemy's offensive capabilities, an ammunition depot was struck in the temporarily occupied territory of Novi Svet in the Donetsk region. Earlier, on November 11th, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that Ukrainian Defense Forces had struck the Saratov oil refinery, the marine oil terminal in temporarily occupied Feodosia in Crimea, and a number of facilities in the temporarily occupied territory of the Donetsk region. The Saratov oil refinery produces more than 20 types of petroleum products and is involved in meeting the needs of the Russian occupation army.
A series of explosions was recorded, after which a massive fire was observed in the target area.
As noted by the General Staff, the marine oil terminal in temporarily occupied Feodosia is a key hub for the supply of fuel and lubricants by sea to the temporarily occupied territories in southern Ukraine. It is known that the tanks on the facility's territory were hit. The strikes reported by the General Staff of Ukraine on November 11th and 12th are of strategic importance and reflect a new phase of pressure on Russian military infrastructure and industry. Earlier, journalist Mike Nakis stated, refineries and oil depots in Russia continue to burn, and recently, so do thermal power plants and electrical substations.
The gasoline crisis is spreading and gaining momentum, and soon an energy crisis may join it. Ukraine is systematically cutting Moscow off from sources of electricity.
Nakis stated that, according to the publication Verstka, oil refineries and oil depots in the Russian Federation have been attacked at least 250 times.
Out of the 250 attacks, 213 or 85% were successful. That is, they resulted in at least the ignition of utility buildings or debris falling on the facility's grounds, and in some cases, explosions and fires at processing units or storage tanks, which halted operations for several days or even weeks. The success of the remaining 37 attacks, 15%, could not be confirmed by Syrskyi, but they may have achieved their objectives as well.
A number of analysts claim that for Russian society, these strikes serve as a signal that the war is penetrating ever deeper into the country's territory. For the Kremlin, this is a reputational blow, demonstrating the vulnerability of even strategically important industrial sites. Overall, the series of attacks on industrial and energy infrastructure indicates that Ukraine is intensifying its strategic campaign to exhaust Russia's war economy, as previously announced by President Volodymyr Zelensky. The goal is not only the physical destruction of individual facilities, but also the systematic limitation of the production and logistics capabilities on which the Russian military-industrial complex relies. As the president of Ukraine stated, in 2025, Russia will lose at least $37 billion in budget oil and gas revenues.
Russian oil companies and the energy sector as a whole are losing tens of billions of dollars more. All of this restricts the Russian war machine. Both conventional sanctions against Russia and Ukraine's long-range sanctions are working effectively.
For Russia, this means increased costs for defense, recovery, a possible slowdown in weapons production, weakening of the resilience of the rear economy, and growing internal tension, including pressure on the political leadership.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave his first interview to Russian media after reports of his removal from office, where he tried to justify his fall from grace.
There's a joke that goes, "Our conscience is clean because we rarely use it." But in this particular case, that's absolutely true.
Earlier, Western publications speculated that the official might have lost his position because of the failed summit between the US and Russian presidents. Lavrov missed a Security Council meeting and, for the first time in several years, was not appointed as the head of the Russian delegation at the G20 summit in Johannesburg. In the interview published on November 11th, Lavrov denies the information reported by the Financial Times. The publication wrote that the talks between Putin and Trump fell through after Lavrov, during a phone conversation, gave U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio a list of Moscow's tough demands for peace terms in Ukraine.
Lavrov and Rubio talked on the phone, and before that, the Russians sent a tough memorandum after receiving which, well, the Americans decided that talking to us was pointless, just pointless.
Lavrov stated that the memorandum was delivered even before Putin's conversation with Trump. He also denies that his conversation with Rubio was tense, as reported by the Financial Times.
The memorandum that the Financial Times journalists mention is a so-called non-paper, not an official document, just a completely unofficial draft.
In the interview, Lavrov assured that the memorandum handed over to the U.S., as it seemed in Moscow, recorded the agreements reached at the previous meeting between Putin and Trump. And after the conversation with Rubio, according to Lavrov, meetings were supposed to be organized between the foreign policy and military officials of the two countries and, presumably, their intelligence agencies. No matter what Lavrov says, rumors about his resignation have not stopped for an entire week. The wave of gossip is so strong that the Kremlin has had to publicly comment on the situation twice. So, on October 7th, the press secretary of dictator Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov, assured journalists that Lavrov, of course, continues to serve as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and called reports of a possible resignation false. And the day before, the Kremlin spokesperson promised a media appearance by Lavrov.
If they've already written about it, then.
3 identical offices were created for Putin, but they gave themselves away with the details. For many years, the Kremlin concealed Vladimir Putin's real whereabouts by using specially created duplicate offices. As investigative journalists from the project Sistema have discovered, at least 3 identical rooms were set up for the Russian dictator in different parts of Russia, in Novo-Ogaryovo, Syrskyi, and Valdai. The main evidence for the existence of 3 different offices is the door handle, a decorative line on the wall, and a folder for documents. To spot the differences, investigators analyzed dozens of hours of broadcasts from the program, Moscow, Kremlin, Putin, archives from the Kremlin's website, government procurement documents, and building plans. Although the offices look identical, journalists discovered small but telling differences. In the Syrskyi office, the door handle, ventilation, and seam line on the wall are positioned differently. In the Valdai office, the thermostat and the color of the tabletop differ from the others, and in the Novo Ogaryovo office, it's the original version from 2015. According to journalists' calculations, Putin held about 130 official events in the Valdai office alone, mostly via video link. Since February 2023, the dictator stopped using the Sochi office after fearing attacks from Ukrainian drones. And since 2025, he has also stopped using the office in Novo Ogaryovo. There have also been reports in the media that Putin has body doubles. According to the head of Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, Kirilo Budanov, Putin regularly uses at least 3 body doubles. Recently, journalists exposed 2 of the dictator's doubles. One of them is allowed to speak while the other must remain silent. This conclusion was reached by the publication Bild, which identified the main features by which Putin can be distinguished from his copies. Their facial features, which are difficult to fake, give them away. They differ from the original in the shape of their ears, nose, and other features, as well as in height. The media reported that the real dictator, in order to appear taller, wears handmade shoes with a special elevated heel.
President Volodymyr Zelensky received a report from the head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Kirilo Budanov, particularly regarding the plans of the aggressor country, Russia.
Among the matters we can discuss publicly, Kirilo reported on the available information about Russian plans for the first half of next year, as well as on the key aspects of the geopolitical situation surrounding Ukraine. We are monitoring Russian connections in key regions of the world and restricting them.
The president and the head of the main intelligence directorate also discussed military intelligence operations conducted jointly with other forces. The president stated that he had instructed certain measures to be taken in the interests of Ukraine. Earlier, Volodymyr Zelensky held a meeting with the head of the security service of Ukraine, Vasyl Maliuk, during which it was revealed that one of the Oreshniks was eliminated on the territory of the Russian Federation.
Until now, we had not made this public, but we can say one of the 3 Oreshniks was eliminated at Kapustin Yar by the main intelligence directorate, Security Service of Ukraine, and Foreign Intelligence Service.
As Maliuk reported, this was communicated exclusively to the president of Ukraine, and a few presidents of other countries were also aware of it.
The elimination was 100% successful. It was a very successful mission. At that time, the name Oreshnik was not yet used by the general public. And the Russians, if I'm not mistaken, weren't particularly threatened by it back then. This was the summer before last.
The head of the Security Service of Ukraine also reported that since the beginning of the year, Ukraine's defense forces have successfully struck more than 160 oil extraction and oil refining facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation.
If we take September and October of this year alone, that's 20 facilities. This has led to a shortage of more than 20% in the domestic petroleum products market, the idling of 37% of oil refining capacities, as well as shortages of petroleum products in 57 regions of the Russian Federation, and a ban on gasoline exports until the end of this year.
Maliuk added that these are precisely legitimate targets, since 90% of the budget of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation comes from oil extraction and oil refining. As a result, as the president of Ukraine stated on November 12th, Russia will lose $37 billion in budget oil and gas revenues this year. Among the brilliant special operations of the Ukrainian defenders is WEB, which was carried out by the SBU on June 1, 2025. At that time, 41 Russian aircraft were hit, mostly strategic bombers. It was reported that drones struck 4 military bases, Belaya, Diaghilevo, Olenya, and Ivanovo. Operation WEB was unprecedented in terms of the depth of its impact. Ukrainian drones struck targets at a distance of more than 600 kilometers, covering a third of Russia's territory. The head of the SBU, Vasyl Maliuk, stated that for Russia, the cost of the strike on its aviation amounted to $7 billion. On June 3, 2025, the Security Service of Ukraine carried out a successful underwater attack on the Crimean Bridge, blowing up the structure's supports. This was already the 3rd attack since the start of the full-scale war. Earlier, a Russian pilot flew a Mi-8 helicopter belonging to the armed forces of the Russian Federation over to Ukraine. According to him, he took off from an airfield in Kursk and headed toward the Kharkiv region, flying at a minimum altitude of about 50 meters in radio silence mode. The operation was planned in advance and carried out by Ukrainian intelligence over the course of more than 6 months.